Welcome, everybody, to the Troubadour podcast. Today, I am going to talk with C. Bradley Thompson about Has America Lost Its American Mind? And C. Bradley Thompson, or Bradley Thompson, is the professor of political philosophy at Clemson University and the executive director of the Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism. He's also been a visiting scholar at Princeton, Harvard, and the University of London. His previous books, and we're going to talk about his current book, but his previous books include the award-winning John Adams and the Spirit of Liberty, and Neoconservatism, an Obituary for an Idea. His book, which you can see if you're watching on YouTube or Facebook, is in the left corner of the video, or if you go to troubadourmag.com, I'll put links to all of his work. But his book, which I've been recommending on this show for a long time, his most recent book is America's Revolutionary Mind, A Moral History of the American Revolution and the Declaration that Defined It. So welcome, Brad, and thank you for being on the show. So I'm just curious, now that we're all in quarantine, where are you recording? Are you at home, or you're not at Clemson, I assume, at the moment, but
yeah. Hey, Kirk, it's great to see you. Great to be with your audience. I am in fact at home. Clemson University is now closed for the rest of the semester. All of our classes are going online. So I'm now here working at the house full time. I live in Seneca, South Carolina, next door to Clemson, South Carolina. And I would normally be outside in what I call my redneck office, which is where, in fact, I wrote America's Revolutionary Mind. I wrote literally the entire book sitting outside in my redneck office over the course of 1 year. But because my internet out there is not very good, I've moved into my house office here inside the house.
Yeah. So I think at troubadourmag.com, if you're okay with this, I've seen a picture of your redneck office. I might put, I'm going to make a post for this little video we're doing. I might put a picture of your redneck office because it is an actual redneck office, and and I think it's great because I always think of myself as the trucker who reads poetry. And, the literary trucker. That's how I sometimes talk to people. I'm definitely not, you're a scholar, but I'm definitely not a scholar. But I think there is something to that idea of being a regular person who approaches literary things and scholarly ideas, and that you don't have to be an ivory tower and disconnected from the rest of the world type of a person. And I like that kind of grounded attitude. It's part of what inspires me to do this, because I don't think if I thought you had to be that ivory tower person that I would attempt anything. I wouldn't have the confidence to do that.
Well, I can tell you, Kirk, that if anybody saw my redneck office, they would know that it's not ivory tower.
Yeah.
It's as we say, it's down home.
Yeah.
And it's two Adirondack chairs bound together, so I can take advantage of the two wide arms where I put my laptop, and then I have a big cooler on my left side where I pile up my books, and so I'm all set. I've got my laptop, I got all my books, and I literally wrote the entirety of America's Revolutionary Mind outside, except when it was raining, and when it started to rain, then I would move my redneck office inside the garage and just sit at the opening of the garage. And so the book was written entirely outside.
Yeah, that's it. Now, do you write, just before we get into this, because I'm curious, I often try to ask writers process questions because I'm a writer, or I try to be. And so do you write everything by hand when you say
No.
Okay. So you actually have a computer out there.
Yeah, my laptop. So I don't write anything by hand anymore. I used to. So when I started graduate school, so this was in the mid 1980s, and I was still writing my papers by longhand. And in fact, because I press, my grip on a pencil is so hard and tight that over the course of many years, I developed a permanent indentation in my middle finger of my right hand.
Okay.
Yeah, which I still partly have, actually.
Oh, wow. The perils of academic life, huh?
Yeah. Uh, the second year I was in graduate school, I got my first Apple computer.
Okay.
And I can tell you, I mean, if you're interested in these kinds of process
Yeah.
questions, it revolutionized my intellectual life.
Huh.
There's no question about it. Writing by longhand for me it was a hard process, and I mean that literally hard, because I would get so intense and therefore tense that I would grip my pencil hard, my shoulders were tight, I'd be hunched over my desk writing and then scratching out everything and starting to write again, and it was a very difficult process. But once I got my computer, I was literally able to put my feet up on the desk, have my keyboard on my lap, sit back maybe 4 feet from the screen, and then just start writing. And it had an amazing effect on my writing. I mean, it literally loosened me up, not just physically, but I think intellectually as well.
Hmm.
And so that was the moment when I started writing, and now 2.5 decades later, almost 3 decades later, haven't stopped writing.
That's really interesting. Because my process is kind of reversed almost from what I grew up with. I grew up with that kind of process of writing on a computer, and I switched to writing everything by hand when I read that Ayn Rand wrote everything by hand, and she inspired me in my late teens to pursue a life of literature and fiction. And so I started doing that, and I found it very liberating in the sense of, one, there's no distractions, or there's less distractions. So I can just take a piece of paper and pen and just go somewhere and leave everything behind and
Right.
write. But it also, one thing I've come to think about, and I don't know if there's any research on this, I'm sure there is I felt a deeper connection from my thought to my pen than I do with, typing, because typing is even, I think, a secondary process we learn after writing as kids. Even me in the computer age, I'm 34, so I got a computer. We had our first computer in the house, I think in Windows 95 when I was 10. And I think we might have had something before that, but as a kid, even in elementary school, we had access to computers in our library, even, from first grade. Right.
Right.
And so I grew up with it, but I still learned to write with my hand as the first process from thought to hand. And I write somewhat slow. I could type way faster than I write, and that seems to be one hindrance. But that slowness sometimes makes me write differently than when I type. And
Right.
I sometimes wonder if the reason, we have these beautiful, long, eloquent, paragraph long sentences like the first sentence of the Declaration of Independence, which you talk about, which is a gorgeous, gorgeous sentence. I mean, anybody who studies language, that should be one you should study grammar on. That they had to write with like quills, and they had to dip, and there was like a
Right.
slowness to it. So I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah. There's no doubt that much of the greatest literature of Western civilization was written with pen or pencil and paper. I'm not sure that there's been any great literature written via computers. I mean, it was all, or if not pen and pencil, it was, as you suggest, quill dipped in ink. And so, yeah, it does slow the process down. I mean, I think it becomes contemplative in a certain kind of way. But I just know for me, it was getting a computer was an intellectually liberating experience, and by which I mean that it freed up my writing.
Yeah.
Not so much in terms of getting information from the internet, which we can all do, but it literally just relaxed me and liberated my mind. And so now writing is what I do every single day. So you asked about my writing process. I typically get up every morning at 4:30 or 5, somewhere in that range, and Before the Redneck office, I would just come to my office here in the house and would start working within half an hour of getting up. And then I would write every day. I do write every day. So from very early in the morning, somewhere between 5 and 6, I'll start writing. And I write usually, I try to write until 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, if it's during the week. If it's a weekend day, then I might just write all day long. But I do try to get in a good 5 or 6 hours of writing just about every single day. And for me, the most important thing is just it's consistency. So I'm very jealous with my time. I'm fortunate in that I have a job in which I can block out big chunks of time whenever I want. It could be at night, it could be in the middle of the afternoon, but my preference is the early morning. And so I just try to write every single morning. And sometimes, it's not much more than just writing down, random thoughts. But the idea is just to, and this would be my advice to young writers, to be a writer, you have to write.
Yeah.
And that means to write all the time. Right. Even if you have just some idea that just comes to mind. And I used to keep, when I was in graduate school, for instance, I used to keep in my breast pocket here a pack of cue cards, so that wherever I was, I could always be writing. So back in the day, I didn't have a vehicle, and I had about a 1.5 mile walk to the university every day. So I have my stack of cue cards, and by the time I got to the library, I probably had 3 or 4 cue cards full of notes already written, just from the walk to the university every day.
Yeah. Yeah. So I just find that interesting. Thank you for explaining your process. I've heard similar process of, obviously write every day is critical. Writers write. I think that's really the main ingredient. I still haven't found like what process, like I like the longhand, but I'm still experimenting with other things. Like I was looking into, just getting a laptop that just has nothing on it but a writing, like my Word or something. That's it. But you can't do anything else with it. But anyway, I didn't want to go forever into that. I want to talk to you about not just how you write, which is interesting to some people at Troubadour Podcast. I know there are a lot of creative types. So I think that hopefully that's helpful. But in this case, what you're writing about, and in particular, what you've been writing or what you've worked on in the recent past and just published. And so let's get into your book a little bit. And I thought in your book, America's Revolutionary Mind, and I thought one way to frame it would actually be to start with the end, which is this is a book that you don't want to just read the end. It wouldn't make sense in and of itself if you're not familiar with the ideas, because I think you take a very different approach than many historians that I know of. And I don't know if you agree with that, but I think there is even I guess an epistemological approach that's a little bit different that I like a lot about yours. And I'll just say it's, maybe we can mark on this before I read this passage. A remark on this is I've noticed with a lot, I shouldn't say a lot because I don't read that much, I guess, but the ones that I've read or heard, the historians, there is a tendency to do a kind of a top-down approach. So just for instance, something like I've heard many libertarian historians put out there that the cause of the Civil War would be something like a desire for states' rights, right? And that's really what motivated people. And then when you ask for evidence, they'll like quote some general's letter, like a letter or something like that. And I'm like, how is that enough evidence to prove? Like maybe I'm sure that's one thing they were thinking about, but that doesn't seem sufficient. And in reading your book, you really dive into the writings, the newspaper articles, the pamphlets, like the amount of first case sources. So I look at it as like you just kind of jumped into the deep end of all the things all the people from a variety of sources said, then try to come up with here are the basic ideas that they probably approached. And sometimes some people didn't come out that great. For instance, I think Thomas Jefferson, in your slavery chapter, I think you convinced me, like I had a kind of view that he was all perfect and he was just part of the time. But I think you make a good point about some of his moral weaknesses at this time. And I think that's the way you put it, was moral weakness. And I think when I thought about it, I was like, yeah, I mean, that you can't really escape that when you really look at the times. So I just want to get your opinion on approaches to history that you put into this book.
Sure. So you'll note that the subtitle of the book is A Moral History of the American Revolution and the Declaration that defined it. So the obvious question is, what is a moral history? Now, the fact of the matter is the American Revolution is, along with the Civil War, the most written about subject in American history. There are scores, if not hundreds, of books written on the American Revolution. And there are social, political, constitutional, diplomatic, religious, even environmental histories of the American Revolution. But the one thing that there has never been is a moral history of the American Revolution. So in many ways, I think that's what makes this book unique and distinct from all others on the American Revolution. So how is it that I came up with this idea of a moral history? And by a moral history, what I did was I developed a kind of methodology. And so for any great work of history to be genuinely path-breaking, it has to have either a new methodology that it uses to look at the past in ways that have not previously been available to scholars, or it has to have all kinds of new historical evidence that it's unearthing for the first time that people haven't seen. And of course, the best case scenario is you have both. You have both a new methodology by which to view an old topic, and you have new evidence by which to explain an old topic. So I came to develop this idea of a moral history reading a couple of passages, one of which is a very famous passage that scholars have known about really since the Revolution itself. And it was a letter that John Adams wrote to Thomas Jefferson in 1815. And in that letter, Adams was attempting to explain the nature, the meaning of the American Revolution. And he asked the question, what was the revolution? Was it the war? And he says, no, it was not the war. The war was only a consequence of the true revolution. The true revolution, he said, was in the minds of the American people. And then he went on to say that it was a moral revolution in the minds of the people, and that revolution took place in the 15 years before a shot was fired at Concord or at Lexington, which is 1775. So he actually dates the beginning of the American Revolution to 1760. So the critical period is this period from 1760 to 1775, during which time, Adams argues, a moral revolution occurred in the minds of the people. Now, Thomas Paine in the early 1780s, in a famous letter to the Abbé Mably in France, again, like Adams, was trying to explain what had happened in the American Revolution. And Paine likewise said that there had been a moral revolution that had taken place. He said that the Americans see with new eyes, hear with new ears, and think new thoughts. And the new thoughts that they think with are concerned with the nature of rights. So that was my clue. So then I began this search for what this moral revolution was in the minds of the American people. And what I came to realize is that the revolution was a comprehensive intellectual moral revolution. But let's just focus on one concept, although in many ways this revolution in ideas revolutionized the way Americans thought about a whole range of subjects. But let's just take one in particular, and let's take the idea of rights. So in the early 1760s, right, you have to remember that the American colonists were just that. They were colonists. They were colonists of the British Empire. They were loyal subjects of the king and of the British Parliament. And they thought that the British Constitution was the greatest in the history of the world. And they also believed in the idea of the rights of Englishmen. They thought that they were the inheritors of the rights of Englishmen. So in 1765, when the Stamp Act was passed, it caused a revolution in the Americans' thinking, because they realized for the first time that if Parliament can pass a tax on them without their consent, that they were then being denied their traditional rights of Englishmen. But the rights of Englishmen are the rights of a particular people at a particular place at a particular time. In other words, those rights are subject to change over time. And the Americans came to realize that the only way that they could oppose the Stamp Act was to oppose it on principles of natural justice. That is to say, principles that don't evolve over time, but rather are grounded in an objective, absolute, certain, permanent, universal set of core principles, and in this case, rights. And so, in many ways, this revolution in the moral principles of the American people revolved around the idea of rights. They came to discover the idea that rights have to be, as they put it, natural, right? So rights that are natural are absolute, certain, permanent, universal. They're not subject to change. So that was sort of the particular or the central moral concept that the Americans first challenged in the context of their battle with Great Britain, and then they developed this idea of natural rights. Now,
I wanted to ask you something about that natural view that I think is important for people to understand, is that was something coming out of science and the Enlightenment, correct? That there could be these universal laws. And this is something that I've studied in the poetry itself. When you read poems by John Donne, there is a metaphysical divide between the cosmos and the earth, and he makes a hierarchy. And this is in the 1600s. And I think you see this in literature, you see this in art, you see this all the time when there are laws and there's divine law and it doesn't apply to us, right? And there is this view that it's separated, and that is shattered by, people like Newton, who are proving universally that the laws of the cosmos is the same, or that there's, it's universal around both of them, which has a lot of implications about what's possible in ourselves and about knowing ourselves. And there's, because if there's something divine out there, that means there's something outside the realm of our ability to know things and about ourselves, about our fundamental nature. And so we have to, I think that's an important part of that I saw in your book, that this is a revolutionary idea that's coming out of the Enlightenment. And a big part of it is what's happening in science that's crossing over into politics and into aesthetics and into every realm of a person's life, their ethics, the way, and like you said, the way they think. And so I just think that's important for people to understand. I try to stress this all the time, that it's really hard for us to comprehend living in a world where there's literally two different spheres of existence. There's, this cosmos sphere. And I really think that reading poetry and literature can help you internalize that, what it felt like to live in that kind of world, in that hierarchy. And in that hierarchy, a king makes a lot of sense, right? If you're going to have someone who's close to that divine, that makes sense if you're living in that kind of world.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And the first two chapters of the book are really concerned with the Enlightenment background of the American Revolution. And I think you're absolutely right to suggest that the Americans were deeply influenced by the great Enlightenment thinkers. And I think for say John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Wilson, the three greatest thinkers of the Enlightenment were Francis Bacon and his work, the Novum Organum, Newton's Principia Mathematica, Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica, and then finally John Locke and his two great works. First, the Essay Concerning Human Understanding, which is a work in primarily epistemology. And then secondly, his famous Second Treatise of Government. And so Bacon, Newton, and Locke really provided a kind of intellectual inspiration for American revolutionaries. And their ideas were being studied in American colleges beginning in the 1740s and 50s in particular. And so these leading American revolutionaries were being educated in the ideas of the Enlightenment. And the ideas of the Enlightenment, I think, can be just summed up in a few words. In metaphysics, which is the branch of philosophy concerned with the nature of reality, it's nature. In epistemology, the branch of philosophy concerned with the nature of human knowledge, it's reason. And in ethics, which is the branch of philosophy concerned with human action and relations, the one-word principle of the Enlightenment, I think, was rights. And so what the Americans did was they, based on the new science, what they did was they really took Bacon and Newton's natural laws of nature or scientific laws of nature, and they attempted to apply those, certainly the methodology which discovers the new science, apply it to things human, apply it to things moral. So the Declaration of Independence in the first sentence talks about the laws of nature and of nature's God, right? So what they were doing is they were trying to discover the moral laws of nature in the same way that Bacon and Newton had discovered the scientific laws of nature. This is actually the principal task of Locke's Essay Concerning Human Understanding. And I think American revolutionaries were really the students of John Locke. And they took very seriously the idea that you could have a demonstrative or secular science of ethics. And so they began the process when they were college students, and this is absolutely true of John Adams, when he was a student at Harvard College. He took the methodology that he had learned from Bacon and Newton, and he applied it to the human condition. And he did it in three ways. He looked out. So the first is extrospection. You look out into the world and you observe inductively human action. And you try to identify the sources or causes of human action as a result of observing their behavior. And then secondly, you introspect. You turn in on yourself and you try to examine internally the operations of your own mind and the passions and the relationship between the mind and the passions. And then finally, you study history. And you try to study history as an inductive science from which you induce certain principles of human nature that then can be applied morally to human relations. So that was the methodology that they used, and it was the methodology that they used to think seriously about what I think are the two major moral concepts of the American Revolution, which are first the moral laws of nature, and then secondly the moral rights of nature. And in terms of the substance of the philosophy of the American Revolution, that's the heart and soul of what the American Revolution was about. Now, I've sort of wandered away from the original question.
No, I took you off course. That's my fault.
No,
I just wanted to clarify and get some ideas. But yeah, I wanted to get back to the idea of the different methodologies you applied versus if there's something else. But yeah, that was all me.
Yeah, no, that's good. So the other part of what I'm calling the new moral history is that it attempts to unite theory and practice. So most historians, generally speaking, and of the American Revolution in particular, tend to view either ideas abstracted from actions, or actions abstracted away from ideas, right? Or they view history from the bottom up, simply the history of ordinary people doing ordinary things, which it turns out ordinary people don't find very interesting. And or on the other hand, they view history from the top down. That is, they view the ideas of a few thinkers, a few statesmen, and they just study those ideas abstracted away from action. So what the new moral history does is it attempts to unify theory and practice. So I'll give you a concrete example. So you take the Declaration of Independence I mean, the Declaration of Independence is the exemplar of the new moral history, because it is both a theory, but it was also an action to which those who signed it dedicated their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor, right? So, the actual writing of the Declaration, and then the living out of the principles of the Declaration of Independence. That is to say, one, declaring independence; two, going to war; three, fighting and dying. Right? This is literally speaking, the putting into practice of the ideas contained in the second sentence of the Declaration, the sentence that begins, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness," etc., etc., right? Those principles are what motivated ordinary, everyday Americans, farmers in Western Massachusetts, and mechanics in Philadelphia or New York City, to pick up their muskets and go to war and face starvation, face disease, and then ultimately to face death itself, right? They were motivated by certain ideas. So what the new moral history does is there's a middle term between ideas and action, and the middle term is motivations. And most scholars, most historians of the 20th century don't think that historians can understand or uncover the motives of human action. They can study ideas abstracted from real individuals, or they can study actions abstracted from ideas, but they can't link the two through motivations, which they say you can't know. And I disagree. I say that the principal responsibility of historians is to link ideas and actions through understanding motivations. And so that's sort of what the new moral history is about. That's the methodology of the new moral history. And of course, that begins with certain assumptions. It begins with the individual as the primary unit of moral value. And it says that historians can observe and understand how and why individuals act as they do. It assumes that individuals are independent and free agents who have free will, who act based on certain ideas, and whose ideas and whose actions can be understood as through intention. We can understand intentions, which are the same as motivations.
Yeah, I think so that methodology makes a lot of sense. It makes me think of my favorite biography of a founding member, not a founding father. So I relate personally. I don't know if you have. I know John Adams is special to you, correct?
Yes.
So John Adams is special. I'd be curious, just real briefly, do you have one person, one founding father, founding member at this era who maybe not just that you admire, but that you identify as similar to you in some way? For me, I'll just say it's Paul Revere, actually. From what I've read, I feel like I'm more like I really liked his he's not as intellectual as some of the other ones. He was more a man of action than many, but he wasn't stupid either, right? He wasn't ill-informed, and I really liked. There was a biography I read. It's my favorite biography, and I forgot the author's name, of course, but it's on Paul Revere and his famous Midnight Ride, and I thought that was amazing. And one thing that was similar to what you're saying about this approach of ideas and action and understanding the everyday person's motivation that I think will even reinforce what you're saying is I remember a story in there about a militia that was getting ready for the redcoats coming. I believe it was Lexington. They saw that there was fires on the horizon and this was becoming an issue because nobody wanted to fight, as you know, like there was reluctance at the beginning. And the militia leader was reluctant and possibly going to make them all disband. And it was individual men in the militia, not the leaders, just the people who basically were like, it got to the point where we're going to kill you and go do it anyway, right? Which points to the kind of individualistic motivation. And I think part of it had to do because it was their own independent farms that was at risk, of course. But I think it's similar to what you're saying in terms of the motivation was that they became more, this is mine. I'm an independent spirit. And anyway, so that was a long-winded thing about Paul Revere is my personal hero. And I think he embodies exactly what you're talking about between ideas and action, even though he wasn't a deep philosophical thinker. And do you have a person that not only you admire, but that you identify as a founder?
Yeah, yes and no.
Okay.
Right? So, I mean, I think all of the founders were heroes to one degree or another, or in one way or another. And so I admire all of them, but for different reasons. So, yeah. I mean, if you take the 5 or 6 principal founders, that is Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison. I mean, there are 6, profoundly different personalities and characters, moral characters. And, each of them had massive virtues and they all had their vices, either intellectual, moral vices, or just sort of vices of personality. So, it is true that, I mean, I spent a long time studying and living with John Adams. So obviously I have a great affinity for John Adams. I love his story. I do think he is America's greatest founding father. And I think that can be demonstrated objectively and actually rather quite easily. I mean, Adams, in many ways, I think Adams's greatness was that he, more than any other revolutionary, united theory and practice, by which I mean he was a great intellectual. He was, in many ways, the leading intellectual of the American Revolution. He wrote some of its greatest pamphlets. He was the author of the most important state constitution, the Massachusetts Constitution, and he wrote the first great work of American political theory, namely A Defense of the Constitutions of the United States of America, in 3 volumes. But he was also a man of real action. I don't think anybody dedicated as much of their life to the cause of the revolution as did Adams. He was away from either all or some parts of his family for 9 years, between 1774 and when he returned from England in the late 1780s. And he worked tirelessly when he was in the Continental Congress in 1774 and 1775. No one worked harder in the Congress than did Adams. He was described as the Atlas of independence. And some of the stories which I could tell you about relative to his journeys in Europe when he was there during the 1780s as a diplomat, I mean, they're just astounding and harrowing, actually. So, Anyway, Adams is the one I think I most closely identify with. I mean, I personally identify with a young man who came from very modest means and through his talent and ability and hard work rose in the world and succeeded. And in that sense, I admire Alexander Hamilton as well, whose story is even more dramatic in that sense than Adams's. I admire the mind of James Madison, and I admire the eloquence of Thomas Jefferson. So they're all great men. I admire them all, and love them despite their vices.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I was just curious. I think, but the overall point has been this new methodology that unites theory and practice, and what your book is describing or expressing and kind of proving is the particular shift that happened that was motivated by that quote you were referencing at the earlier about the real revolution was in the minds of Americans. And so that is, I think, an important topic. The idea that we can know what the minds of Americans are in a general sense, correct? And that's something you argue in the book and you prove through lots of evidence and through, I think, really good arguments. I think, like you were talking about with the relationship between the Declaration and, the many ideas that percolated in America before that and the events that occurred before that and why it was written and everything. And also the anti-slavery or the slavery chapter, I think, was a really good example of mixing those two together, right? And to show, and I think also in credit to your book, even more the challenge of something like that without evading it, right? Because I think some people may evade the reality of the conflict that they had, but you really break it down and show, you do show the reality and why it was really challenging. We need to take the reality seriously, but there are things to be taken into consideration that maybe they could have done other things. And maybe there was a kind of, especially I'm thinking of Thomas Jefferson in particular, who did have slaves while he was writing this thing that clearly said all men are created equal. And so there's like, it just kind of harmed him morally and psychologically because there's a split between his idea and his action. And that caused a big problem, which of course resolves itself horrifically in 1860 with the bloodiest American War, which was the Civil War. And that conflict between ideas and action is what led to the combination of those two coming together in the Civil War for a bloody battle. And I think that all goes to this revolution of the mind and your methodology, right? Now, sorry, do you have something to add?
No,
okay.
No. I mean, that sums it up quite nicely.
Yes. All right. I did a good job then. All right. I'm a good student. I try to be. So now the next question is, if we can know that, what I wanted to phrase, I said this at the very beginning, has America lost its American mind, right? Has America lost its American mind? And with things that are going on in the culture today, we're doing this. What day is it? I'm even losing track of the day. It's the 20th. It's Friday, March 20th, 2020. And of course, it's raging with coronavirus, quarantines, as we talked about at the beginning, lots of government lockdowns. I'm seeing, article after news person after, if we're trying to figure out what is the American mind today and what might have changed and hasn't, I think the reaction to this particular event is very telling in terms of that issue of what's changed. And well, first I was curious, what do you think there is that original revolutionary mindset of, the idea of we see things differently, we hear things different thoughts, we think different or we hear from different ears, we think with different thoughts. Obviously, it's more complicated in the 21st century, but do you think any remnants of that, any significant remnants, I should say? Because obviously I think forever those remnants will be there because they exist. You exist, I exist. But are there significant remnants of that in the culture today?
Yes, most definitely. How much, how large is really hard to know. The first clause of the second sentence of the Declaration begins, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." So if I had to identify the single major difference between 18th century Americans and 21st century Americans, I would say that it is bound up in this idea of truth. Mm. American revolutionaries believed in the idea that there is this thing we call truth, which is an objective relationship between reality and the human mind, and that the principles and concepts that are induced by the mind from reality are true, they are absolute, objective, certain, permanent, and universal. All American revolutionaries believed in that concept truth. But of course, now in the 21st century, you can have Time magazine running a cover which says, "Is truth dead?" Question mark. And of course, the Oxford Dictionary's 2016 word of the year was post-truth. Wow. Right? So it's said we live in a post-truth society. And I think that is the fundamental difference between the 21st and the 18th centuries. And if it's the case that we live in a post-truth society, that means that it's manifested in innumerable ways, right? So you and I could spend the next 6 hours just giving concrete examples of how it is, why it is that we live in a post-truth society. I mean, it would literally, I'm not sure we could end the conversation in 6 hours. But there are innumerable concrete examples of this in literally every facet of our lives today. And I see it most concretely in American universities, which are openly and proudly post-truth. So for me, that's the biggest difference. And by the way, I just need to, if I could, pause and give a shout out to my wife. It was her idea to title the epilogue to the book, "Has America Lost Its American Mind?" I had some other title, some somewhat more academic-y kind of title. I think that had to do with post-truth or something like that. Yeah. And she came up with "Has America Lost Its American Mind?" And it's a cracker of a title. Yeah. I've done 30 interviews in the last few months on the book, and everybody comments on the title of the epilogue. Yeah, so kudos to my wife for coming up with a brilliant title.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I mean, yeah, I mean, it's very resonant, and so she did, and you did a good job for agreeing with it, not fighting it, even though like it wasn't your idea. I think that's sometimes writers, we said no, well, just because it's not ours, right? So that's good to have both that environment, right?
Yeah, except that I did say no initially.
Initially, yeah. Well, that's our nature, I think, as creatives, to kind of fight things that aren't ours at first, at least for me, and then eventually it percolates, and I'm like, ugh, they were right. They were right all along. Yeah,
that's exactly what happened.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think there's I think it's a losing the American mind, the idea of truth. I never thought about that. And when you were saying that, I all through my mind while you were saying that, I was obviously listening 100%, but also through my mind were conversations I've had with educated people, and that is always where it ends up. If I dig into the conversation with someone, it's all like, I don't think it's 20% of the time or 80% or not. It's 100% of the time. Well, we can't really know everything, right? We can't know for certain. There is, and it comes to some form of, you can't say that with 100% certainty. There is no universal truth. And, I never thought about that as like, that's the fundamental. So I think that's, for me, a big takeaway, just from this conversation, that the biggest part is the issue of truth and the loss of truth. And it's been chipped away, really, which is not just a political issue, like you said, it's a whole, it's epistemological, which means that it filters into morality, filters into even how we think about metaphysics, right? And it's almost going back to a different version of that split between the cosmos that I talked about, where now there's a realm of the divine cosmos that's somewhat unknowable and beyond our understanding. And then there's our world, right? And so that, that's really kind of scary, in terms of living in a world that doesn't have truth and that we can't argue for something. And I think like this, the split that we have in our country, that divide is an impassable chasm if we can't prove that there's such a thing as truth universally, right?
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, I would argue that the world in which we live today in the 21st century is more dishonest than the medieval world of the high church, because at least the high church thought there were two realms, right? So at least there was the realm of the here and now, which may have been a shadowy, imperfect reflection of the higher world, but at least there was some recognition of the world that was here and now. But we live in a world today where it's actually reality which is under attack.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh,
so,
I see what you're saying. Yeah.
So, and you can see that. I mean, you can see this right in the debates over, over global warming. You can see them in all kinds of different ways in our culture today. And so, it's the world in which we live today. I mean, is tragically coming closer and closer to the world described in Orwell's dystopian 1984. Right, we're coming close to living in a world where 2 + 2 = 5.
Well, at least that's what they can convince people. And sometimes I think that with I don't know your feeling on the preponderance of statistics. I have a particular frustration with statistics as replacements for facts. I'm just trying to get into like what truth is a little bit. And I don't know, right. Like when you talk about the 2 + 2 + 5, it makes me think of, I think statistically, like with stats, people could probably try to make that case. But I just have a difficult, like I believe stats, because of the coronavirus, and I'm always inundated with stats, and when I look at them, I'm like, well, it doesn't seem to cover everything though. And it's like, it's very difficult to come to a truth, but that's what's necessary, is to be able to come to some kind of, obviously with something like that, you can't necessarily have a universal truth that this is the answer, coronavirus, because there's a lack of information. And that's not what you're arguing. You're arguing about kind of moral truth, and that truth is possible, right? So there is an action. So I guess if I switch into that gear and like what it is that Americans right now with the coronavirus and with this lack of truth, what, like if this was happening and the spirit of the 1770s was here now, how do you think we would react to a serious threat with lack of information, right? That's what I'm curious about. Is I have my view of how I want to act and how I think we should act, but I'd be curious what you thought.
Yeah, that's a hard question to know how to answer. So what I'm about to say is purely speculation. But the one thing I'm pretty sure of is that, say in the 18th century, when there was the possibility of the spread of smallpox, for instance, which was real in the 18th century. I find it very difficult to believe that the government would claim or assert its police powers to create a massive government intrusion in areas that are not even related to the particular illness, right? So, I mean, for me, the great fear over the coronavirus threat, which is real, how real it is, I don't think anybody really knows. I mean, there's all kinds of every single day I'm reading conflicting data on the spread of the coronavirus. So I don't have any view on that other than to say it's real and everybody should take care of themselves and do everything they can not spread it or to prevent getting it. Right. So we shouldn't we college students ought not to be in Fort Lauderdale right now in 1,000-person disco doing what they do, right? That doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. But on the other hand, I mean, it seems pretty clear that the cause for the mass spread of this, the nationwide global spread of this, has to do with the failure of government, and not the failure of government to do something, but the problem, of course, has been that government, take the CDC or the FDA, they're the principal villains in the context of the United States for all of their regulations, which have prevented pharmaceutical companies from discovering either a virus or just a cure for it, which I think they're able to do. In fact, I mean, I'm reading just in the last 24 hours, right, that they've developed now medicines which are going to be able to deal with this. So, and I mean, the great tragedy of all of this is that, I mean, the real villain in all of this is the communist government in China, which didn't reveal this information to the rest of the world for
3 weeks. Yeah, at least.
And that made, I think probably more than 3 weeks. And that made all the difference. And the great tragedy is that, all right, so we recognize that the communist government is the problem, but we're now imitating and replicating many of the government actions of the Chinese communists in this country. Right. So for me, the great threat now is actually less the coronavirus and more the destruction of the economy and the destruction of freedom in this country.
Yeah, for me, and I think for you too, it's probably more the destruction of freedom and liberty, because that's going to lead to a destruction of the economy, of course. So maybe this is a good time to talk about the consent of the government, the nature of the government, and that you talk about in your book a lot, and how they framed that in the revolutionary period and how that's changed today, because that what you just said is exactly my view in terms of, I think the virus is, we don't have a lot of information, but it's clearly, clearly deadly and a problem. And it may be even a pretty serious problem. Now, from what I'm seeing, this is just what I've read. I don't think it's going to be the global devastating, a billion people type death type thing, which would, destroy, it's like on greater than a great war type of a thing. I don't think it's gonna be like that, but I do think it would be, although again, I could be wrong. I just don't see that from what I'm hearing from infectious disease experts, but it definitely is a bad thing that a lot of people who otherwise might have had some extra time, I think it's, with people over 70 is at risk the most, that they're dying, and some young people with underlying conditions, from what I'm understanding, are also dying a lot too. And that's all bad. And this is, all death is going to always be bad. And there's no one that's going to be arguing that, oh, okay, that's not a big deal. So the virus is a big deal, but the question, is what is the government? What is its consent and job? And I do think you would agree that there are some things that a government should do in a situation like a pandemic. But the question is, what's the limits? Where does it end? What are the procedures? Things of that nature. because I just cannot wrap my head around as an American how, without any evidence, they can quarantine me, without any evidence of my being infected, right? So it's just a general quarantine, and there's no, like, if you don't have the evidence for, like, obviously, if I'm, the analogy that some intellectuals have used is like, if I'm spewing out daggers, and killing people around me, then I can see by force, even if I don't want to, putting me in a quarantine, right? Like, I think that's completely legitimate. You don't have a right to kill other people. I think that's a clear line. But the question is, do you have a right to get other people a common cold or even possibly influenza? If it's where does that line,
Yeah.
and there definitely has to at least be evidence. That's what I'm not liking about this situation is there's no evidence that I have it. It's just this broad fear spectrum. And so we're just going to lock everyone down. So that's where I'm coming from with all of this. And I just can't see the justification of the government and people that I respect and admire who I've seen advocate for these lockdowns. And I'm like, I just don't understand how you can justify that based on what the government should and shouldn't be doing. So why don't we talk a little bit about the consent of the government, the nature of the government, and where does maybe the first question, where does government get its authority from according to the founders?
Right. So my book is it's a study of two things, two related, connected things. The first is the Declaration of Independence, and then secondly, the revolution as a whole. And what it does is it uses the Declaration of Independence as a kind of ideological roadmap by which to study the revolution as a whole. So there are, in the Declaration of Independence, 4 self-evident truths listed. And so what I do in the book, and those rights or those self-evident truths can be summed up each in one word: equality, rights, consent, and revolution. So what I do in the book is I devote 2 chapters to each one of the 4 self-evident truths. So there are 2 chapters on equality, 2 on rights, 2 on consent, 2 on revolution. And then what I do is I trace the development of each of these moral political concepts from the late 17th century up through the 18th century, but then spend most of my time in these 2 chapters for each of these self-evident truths to examining how American revolutionaries developed these truths from approximately 1760 up through 1776 and their explication in the Declaration of Independence. All right, so in other words, what I'm trying to do then is trying to create what Thomas Jefferson referred to as an American mind. Jefferson once said before he died that the purpose of the Declaration was to serve as an expression of the American mind. So what I'm doing is I'm using the Declaration to trace the history of the 4 self-evident truths of the Declaration with the end goal of trying to establish what the American mind was in 1776. And I think the American mind can really be summed up in the 4 self-evident truths of the Declaration, right? First truth, we hold these truths, we hold these truths to be self-evident. 1, that all men are created equal. 2, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The 3rd self-evident truth says that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. All right. And then the 4th self-evident truth, which is a much longer one, which I'd actually have to get my declaration out and read because I haven't quite memorized it. But you're focusing on the 3rd self-evident truth, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So that's a complex, unlike the 1st and 2nd self-evident truths, that's a very complex concept. And if you break it down, if you parse it into its three parts, it says, one, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, right? So, in other words, the purpose of government is to secure rights. It doesn't say that the purpose of government is to promote virtue or to make men good or to make them religious. It says that the purpose of government, the sole purpose, is to secure rights. Right? That's the purpose of government. And then I'm going to pull my declaration out to make sure I parse this correctly. All right, so that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Now, what does that mean? It means that, or it implies at least, that government is something which is created, which implies a state before there was government. And so this is a kind of a subtle reference to John Locke's discussion in the Second Treatise of Government of the so-called state of nature. So implied in the Declaration's third self-evident truth is the suggestion that there is a state of nature where men's rights are insecure. And so therefore, individuals in this Lockean state of nature, which turns out to be almost identical to Hobbes's state of nature, which is described in Hobbes's Leviathan as nasty, poor, brutish, and short. In other words, rights are entirely insecure. It's a state of anarchy. Mm-hmm. So in that state, individuals come together and they form a social contract. And they do that by each man giving his consent to the creation of a new government, the sole purpose of which is the protection of rights. And implicit in that is the idea that each and every individual is a self-owning, self-governing individual with rights that are absolute and cannot be taken by other individuals or by governments. And in fact, the purpose of government is to create a government. So America, let's make this clear, America's founding fathers were not anarchists. They did believe in government, but they believed in a what we might call, and what they called in the 19th century, basically a generation or two later, the night watchman state, a government that has as its sole purpose, right, the protection of individual rights, which comes in the form of having three functions: a military to protect us from foreigners who would violate our rights, a police system to protect us from individuals within our society who would violate rights, and a court system to adjudicate conflicts between individuals. So that was the founders' conception of government, but it's grounded in this idea that that individuals are self-owning, self-governing, and must give their consent. And in other words, they are sovereign, right? So this idea is based on the sovereignty of individuals and the sovereignty of people living together in communities, which is why the preamble to the Constitution begins, "We the people." It doesn't begin "we the states," it begins "we the people." And the people is understood not in a collectivist sense, but it's understood as the collection of individuals, each of whom is self-owning and self-governing. So they create this government. They have to give their consent to the government, which is a limited night watchman kind of state. But it's also important to understand that for most, I think, American revolutionaries, not all, but I think for most, they believed that government ought to be multi-layered. That is to say that, sure, yes, there can be a national government that has virtually as its sole purpose to protect us from foreign invasion and a few other sort of minor responsibilities. But the real locus of political power is at the state level, and more particularly at the local level. So take Thomas Jefferson, for instance. Jefferson believed in the idea of what he called ward government, That is to say, governments that are where political power is imploded from the national government to the state governments to village, town, and city governments, and even below that to what he called wards, which are in effect neighborhoods. And the reason this is important is because Jefferson really did believe that individuals ought to be self-governing, and self-governing in the fullest sense of the term, right? They ought to determine, whether roads, for instance, ought to be built, how they ought to be built, who should build them, et cetera, or education. They believe that to the extent that there was any kind of communal education, that education should be very much at the local level, right? It should be paid for by the people who live in a particular village or neighborhood, and that parents should control what is being taught in the classroom, how it is being taught, and by whom these things are being taught. So they had, we might put it this way. I would say America's founding fathers had a Lilliputian conception of government. And for those from California, that means really small.
Okay. I've not heard that term before, actually. Lilliputian.
Lilliputian. So, right from Gulliver's Travels.
Oh, okay, yeah. Okay,
right.
Really small. Yeah.
Really, really small people.
Okay, yeah.
So that was in effect their view of government.
I like that.
Government was meant to be small, and it was meant to be close, right? So government should be something that you can literally see and touch, right? Not something that is 2,000 miles away that you can't see, you can't hear, you can't know.
Mm-hmm.
One of the concepts that American revolutionaries developed in the 1760s and 1770s was what they called the spirit of liberty. And the spirit of liberty for American revolutionaries was kind of a jealous spirit. It was to be jealous of one's freedoms and liberties, and to be constantly vigilant in their protection.
I feel that way personally. And this is like what I was talking about earlier right now that's frustrating to me about the people's reactions to this is, for me, I'm third generation American. I have roots in the East Coast, West Coast, and in the South. My mom's from the South. My dad's from Buffalo. I'm from California. So I got roots everywhere. And it boils my blood when you tell me not to do something. Like the second you say, stay at home, quarantine, and there's no evidence, like I automatically want to hop on my Harley and just go wherever the heck I want to go because I'm an American. That's my emotional reaction. Now, whether that's actually the right thing to do, I would think about it. I'm not an idiot, but that I think is the emotional reaction that I want to see from more Americans. It's like, okay, I understand there's dangers. The world is dangerous, but I'm a free person and you can't tell me what to do. And the fact that so many people are just going to lie down during this time, literally, I'm going to go to bed. This is the response I'm basically hearing from people, is so anti-American. It's so frustrating in terms of this spirit of liberty and the spirit of wanting it. Like, I'm willing to die for this. I don't want to die for it, but I'm willing to just go out just because I get to, this is my life and I want to live it. And so that spirit of liberty is one of the things I was really interested in with you and what you were talking about it. Cause I think it's maybe not exactly the same thing as an American mind, but it's, I think, a corollary or related in some way. The emotional fuel of rebellion, rebel with a cause, as you put it. But that rebelliousness is very American, I think. I don't know if you would agree, but
yeah, I think that's right. So the spirit of liberty is both intellectual and, in a sense, even physical, right? It's the unification. The spirit of liberty is the melding together of mind and body, right? So the spirit of liberty intellectually is to understand the principles, the ideas of freedom. But it's not just a kind of intellectual's understanding of moral political concepts. It's also, in a sense, a kind of gut feeling, right? That which is what sort of drives you, impels you to defend it when you think it's being attacked. And so to go back actually to an earlier question that you asked about relative to has America lost its American mind, right? As I think about it, the one thing I would say that many, many Americans have lost is that spirit of liberty. Mm-hmm. And even those who claim to be a part or defenders of the American spirit of liberty. So let's say, the early version of the Tea Party, right? Mm. Even most of these people in the Tea Party, were in one way defenders of the welfare state. How many of them would be willing to get rid of Social Security or
hands off my Medicare?
Hands off my Medicare. Yeah. Exactly right.
Yeah.
So, and this goes back now also to what we were talking about just a few minutes ago relative to coronavirus. So if the governor of California has the power and is willing to use that power to shut down all activity in the state of California over coronavirus, having now set the precedent, having set the precedent for future use, are there other instances in which individuals can be quarantined not related to disease? Mm-hmm. That's an open question.
Yeah, I mean, I think people underestimate the importance of precedents in these cases in terms of now that you've done this one thing, you can do it again. There's now we could do this with natural disaster. And then how far away are we from doing this in terms of, well, now we have global warming and, which I don't want to get into exactly, but whatever your views are. But the question is like, what kind of liberties can we take in order to secure your, quote unquote, secure your safety, right? So I think there's a quote I'm thinking of, and I can't remember. It's been so long since I've seen it, but like a government able to provide for all of your things, is said more eloquently, is able to take away all your freedoms, right? It's one of the founders said something like that, but yeah, I mean, the idea of also providing safety in exchange for freedom and liberty, and I think the idea of the perception of safety is now what we're setting the precedence of, is that because when you look at the numbers, we're looking, first off, our fear is based on projections because the numbers are only at a couple hundred dead in America right now. And the fear is, of course, that you're going to have tens of thousands or maybe 1 million dead, which would be horrible. But I don't think it would be as destructive as people think. Like, it wouldn't be a good thing. I don't want that to happen, but people think you're I'm callous for saying this, but it is going to be among the median age of, 75, 80 and with underlying conditions is what we're looking at. That's not a good thing, but it's also something that's not going to destroy the world. But what will destroy the world is our reactions to it. And this spirit of how we're not fighting, I think what the real fear should be, which is this Leviathan growing government that's gaining more precedence in terms of the taking over of liberties, such as my liberty to go to the gym. That's one of the things. I was training for something specific and lifting weights, and now that's gone. I can't do that. A lot of people who do jujitsu and boxing and lots of dancing. I have a dance instructor in Laguna Hills, so she worked really hard she worked hard to get her own dance studio, and now it's shut down. She took a very sad picture of an empty dance studio, and she said, I guess my dancing is non-essential. And I was like, I thought it was a beautiful way of putting it, because I think dancing is essential. And we should all make the decision if we want to dance at a time like this. And it's riskier, but it's my choice, right? Now, but going back to the authority question, because I do think this is an interesting thing. So it seems like what you're saying is they in the Declaration, there's these principles. Are the two clear ones of we're created, we're free. I can't remember them off the top of my head. Free and equal, and we have life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and that we're going to secure these rights among the consent of the governed is the more complex one. But they rest on these previous authorities, previous ideas, right? Not authorities necessarily. And prior to this, the view was divine in terms of where the authority for doing some kind of governmental action, right? So that's kind of the question I'm curious about. Is the founding fathers are all about Lily pushing, right? Is that right? And for the in terms of the government, they want a small government, they want a local government, they want a government that you can see, touch, hear, and presumably fight against with civil liberties or civil unrest if that's what's necessary, which is a lot harder when you're talking about a federal government thousands of miles away. But the question is still, where does, even in our system, the authority to take any action, even of a small action, in terms of like quarantining someone like me if I do have a deadly disease, where does that? Because again, like I said, if it was a democratic system, pure direct democracy, then you would say, like with Greece, ancient Greece, it would be, we would take a vote. This is what we do. Are we going to build these ships to prepare for this Persian invasion? We go and we vote for it, and yes or no. Are we going to kill this colony off? Yes. Are we going to change our mind and send another ship? Yes. And then, there's a lot of problem with direct democracy of changing minds, like, overnight, right? And getting new people to vote and majority rule. But then again, there's the one divine ruler type thing, which has its own problems, of course. But the question is, like, for our system, which is a limited government based on certain rights, still, where does that authority derive from? I guess is what I'm curious about. And I'm sorry, when you say consent of the governed, so that you say consent of the governed, but the issue is, what about the 50? Like, is that then a majority question of 51%, or you know what I'm saying? So where does that? Because if I don't want to be quarantined, how do you justify that?
Yeah, no, that's where the rubber hits the pavement in Republican government, and we do have a republic, not a democracy, and a republic. As James Madison understands it in the 10th essay of the Federalist, is a government based on representation. So properly defined democracy is the direct representation of all the people, right? But which is only possible in a small geographical area, like Athens, for instance, right? So you can't have a democracy in an area larger than where all the people can congregate and vote. So the Republican form of government, which is what America's founding fathers created, is one that is built on the idea of on the one hand, the sovereignty of the people, but on the other hand, the principle of representation. And the principle of representation was devised to be a filtering effect, to filter out the passions, opinions, and interests of the people, such that the representatives of the people would not be motivated and sometimes inflamed by immediate political passions, right? Which happens all the time. Like right now in this coronavirus crisis, right? You have people acting on the basis of passion rather than acting on the basis of knowledge. And part of the problem, of course, is that we don't have a lot of information and knowledge, right? So what are you left with? Well, a lot of people are just left with various passions, including fear and anger. But the idea of representation is to filter out the passions such that the faculty of reason and knowledge can be the basis on which the representatives in our government make decisions for the nation as a whole. But this is where it gets difficult because, as I've said, the purpose of government is to protect the rights of individuals, but a representative body in the government oftentimes will see as its purpose the national interest or the general welfare. So this language is not in the Declaration, but it's certainly in all of the state constitutions, and it's in the federal Constitution, which is this idea of the general welfare, or the common good, which are largely anti-concepts, but they do represent something. But they are often subject, it's almost always subject to abuse, right? I mean, there is no definition of the general welfare.
Yeah.
There isn't,
no,
right?
No.
Who could define what the general welfare is? Well, the general welfare is whatever it is at any given moment in time, and time changes. So the general welfare is always changing. And in the end, it's ultimately defined by whomever is in power. And those who are in power often are less concerned with the so-called general welfare and more concerned with their own welfare, with their own acquisition and sustenance of political power.
Yeah.
So the system, it is a flaw in the system, but the concept that is used is the general welfare. Now, the general welfare, I think, can be defined in such a way that it doesn't have these kind of ominous ramifications and implications. The general welfare can be, I think, properly defined as the welfare of all individuals in the nation. So the general, like national defense, I think, is one way in which the general welfare clause of the Constitution can be defined and legitimized, but it's most often subject to abuse. And one of the other problems built into the American system is, even though you've got representative government, it's still based on majority. And this was Madison's great fear in Federalist 10, namely the tyranny of the majority. The majority making and passing laws that violate the rights of the minority. But, it's a hard question. I mean, on the one hand, you're not anarchists, so therefore you want to have government, and government based on the consent of the people. But once you introduce the concept of consent, then it becomes very much more complicated, because then it's the consent of who? Well, you can't have universal consent. If you have if the standard is universal consent, no law could ever be passed.
Yeah.
Right. So, but if it's majority rule, then at the other end, you're subject to the tyranny of the majority. So it's a problem. So you must then build into your Constitution all kinds of checks and powers that hopefully over time will prevent the government from abusing its powers.
Yeah.
And so we have in our Constitution a complex system of separation of powers, which is the separation of legislative, executive, and judicial power. We also have the division of power, otherwise called federalism, which is the division between federal, state, and local political power. All of those things are good. And we also have built into our constitutional system the rule of law, which is an integral concept in a constitutional republic. So the system is not perfect. The political system, I mean, even the political system as designed by America's founding fathers, has flaws in it, and they knew it had flaws in it. And they built all kinds of checks and balances to prevent those flaws from working themselves out over time. But
so is this maybe one reason why the spirit of liberty is so important? Because if you're talking about securing the rights of the consent of the governed is an important concept, and it is a fluctuating issue to some degree. Like, it will change, people's opinions and views and ideas and thought processes and methodologies will change. And if you can keep alive the spirit of liberty, that's one way to add another check, because if in this case, for instance, enough people rose up and went out in protest to this type of thing, hopefully they would be heard. But if a lot of people are sitting down and taking it lying down, as I think of it, then that's going to dissipate. And then we're going to have, more of that and more of a loss of the spirit of liberty for future instances of this kind of thing happening, when the next pandemic is going to be even worse and they just lock you down for months at a time or a whole year or something like that, and without any kind of worry or problem or anything like that. So just maybe the spirit of liberty is more important now more than ever.
Well, I think that's absolutely true, but here's the problem, Kirk. How do you preserve the spirit of liberty over time?
Yeah.
Right? So given the fact that the spirit of liberty is, in addition to a certain kind of thumos, it's a Greek word for spiritedness, it's also a knowledge of certain ideas and principles. Well, the question is, how do you educate 350 million people in the principles of liberty?
Yeah.
Well, conservatives say, well, the way to fix that problem is to have the government schools do it. But having the government schools do it is a violation of the spirit of liberty.
Yeah.
Right. So that is, this is one of the great conundrums in the context of American freedom, which is how do you perpetuate the spirit of liberty? How do you preserve the spirit of liberty over time, right, without using institutions like the government to promote the spirit of liberty?
Yeah. I think,
right?
Well, just if I could say something, I think that, so a lot of you've written a lot on education, and it has been very inspiring for me to think about, because I went through public schooling in America. I thought it was horrific at the time, even though I didn't have the ability to even assess it. I just felt it was horrific that I had to be here. And I agree, because, it's definitely destructive of the spirit of liberty. And that question of carrying the flame of liberty and the spirit of it and the emotional fuel of it requires, as your thesis, your fundamental methodology for this book and for all of your work between action and ideas, it requires the ideas, right? Because you can't have the spirit of liberty without the ideas that underlie it, I think. And they go together. So you need to, obviously you could be rebellious without a cause. And I think that is a big thing in our culture for the last, since the 70s, maybe, is the idea of rebellion with a rebel without a cause. But I think you want to be a rebel with a cause. And I think having, an idea of, even if you're not clear on it, of what what you're fighting for and why is important. And then the question you ask is, how do you do that with, conservatives have this idea of systematizing it in a government funded school or a government controlled school. And I'm thinking, I'm hoping that what the positives in all of this situation and in the world is actually the internet. And that is a way that, and one positive I think will hopefully come out of the coronavirus fiasco is that more and more people are actually relying more heavily on self-educating, homeschooling. I hope there will be an uptick in homeschooling, which means that there's now hopefully going to be a battle of ideas over what to teach your kids that didn't exist before, because all that existed was what the government decreed, right? What the government approved in terms of what could and couldn't be taught. And so when we're taught, what do they call it? Social science instead of history, right? Like I wasn't taught history, I was taught social science. Well, now you have a choice of, I'm going to teach history. I'm not going to teach social science to my kid, right? Or I'm going to, have my kid do more online stuff in a mixed. So I think that I hope, in terms of the education, I hope that's one positive, is that we are building the tools and the methods to allow, at least for voices like yours, to resonate with young people. Like this could be a good opportunity for high school kids to read your book as a course in history and the moral case for history. So, that's my silver lining, I guess, about all of this. and the fight for the future.
Yeah, I agree entirely. I think, and I've been arguing now for a very long time, that the leaders of the revolution are America's homeschooling mothers,
Mm.
right? To the spirit of liberty is being kept alive in America through homeschooling families, and most homeschooling families are led by the mothers.
Yeah.
And so I am America's single greatest fan of America's homeschooling mothers, who I think really are sort of leaders in the American spirit of liberty. And I know the homeschooling community quite well. My wife and I homeschooled our three children for 18 years. And I mean, if you think about it, it really is radical in the proper definition of what radical is, namely to go to the root. And it's going, homeschooling families are going around the government school system. They're going around the indoctrination and censorship of the government schools. And here's the key point that goes to the issue of the spirit of liberty. America's homeschooling families, they are resurrecting the spirit of liberty by taking full moral responsibility for the education of their own children.
Yeah.
Rather than using the schools as a babysitting service, which is what, unfortunately, and I hate to say it, but it's true, many people use the government schools as a babysitting service.
Yep.
And they have abnegated the responsibility that they have to educate their children.
Yeah.
And that responsibility, by the way, it doesn't have to be homeschooling. It can be parochial schools, or it can be private schools.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of, yeah, and I 100% agree with you. I think it's kind of been directing where I want to go and where I'd like to figure out I don't know how to do it exactly, but you know, the services that I offer, and I'm doing YouTube videos and these kind of videos, but I'm also doing a lot about reading poetry and giving people access to poetry they don't often get. I think one of the, although the internet has so many bad things, we sometimes may forget that pretty much everything that's been written down or drawn is available on the internet. Like I could pull up, we could right now do an analysis of a poem. We could, talk about a great work of literary art. We could pull up pictures of the David and talk about it. I mean, there's so much, and I'm hoping that more people are starting to see the benefits of that lifestyle and, of allowing that, and that, yes, this might mean, and if more people homeschool, if more people do these kind of at home, there's resources like having me talk to a group of kids, like, for once in a while, not as necessarily a teacher, but just like helping them with a particular issue or coming online, right? Or even, a mixture of online and doing, there's just so many options going forward that I hope we push for that as, and I'm all for it. I know you're all for it. I know we know a lot of people who are all for it. I know a lot of, people who do Montessori schools and try to promote that. And I think I agree. That is a big positive for the future. And I hope we keep fighting for that.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I've dedicated my adult life to fighting for a free society. And, it's what I do. And so I'm always looking for allies to join me in that fight. And look, the bottom line is this: you get one life, it's yours, and you should fight for the freedom that is necessary to make your life the best possible life that it can be. And then if you're fortunate enough to have children and then maybe grandchildren, you fight for their freedom and their future. And so I now, I now fight for the freedom of my children who are now coming into adulthood, and their children. And that's what the American spirit of liberty has always been.
And how, besides, of course, buying your books, particularly America's revolutionary mind, how can, let's say there are people who do want to participate, to explore what you're doing, or homeschooling, but how, with you particular, like how can we support what you're doing, get involved, anything like that, projects you're working on? Of course, buy the book. It's, it's a great read no matter what age you are. And if you have high school students, I think it is a good way to approach, American history, because it goes back to the founding, and that's always helpful. But how can we help support you?
Yeah, great question. So I've just launched my first ever website. So your audience, if they're interested, can go to C. Bradley Thompson, all one word, cbradleythompson.com. And I have all of my books and a lot of my public articles and videos that are now available on my website. And we're going to be putting up new content. I think now in this next year, we're going to be putting up a lot of content on my website. And there are a lot of different things there, from, lectures on the American Revolution to lectures on the nature of education and on Marxism and capitalism and all kinds of different things. So, and I think probably sometime in the next 6 months, I'll be launching a larger multimedia platform to promote these ideas. And by the way, I've got to give a shout out. Big shout out to Kirk Barbera, who, that's you.
Oh, me. Okay.
Yeah.
I thought there was another Kirk out there.
No, you. I'm talking about
thanks.
you because what your audience doesn't know is that you and I have been talking off and on now for a couple of years about your projects and about my very slowly developing projects and multimedia platform, which I'm sure you thought was never going to happen, given how slowly I was moving. But it is happening, and I'd say within 6 months we're going to have something much bigger.
Good.
Going.
Well, I will offer, if you want, I'm going to make it public. If you want to do anything like this again on any topic, you are welcome back anytime, as much as you want. I love talking to you, like genuinely love talking to you. I learn a lot every time. And, I really want to do a Ulysses versus Tintern Abbey discussion with you. We've had this offline conversation about poetry, which is, I think, great. So people can see a more full versioned view of scholars being willing to talk about hobbies that they're not experts on. I really enjoy listening to a scholar who's not necessarily an expert in this, but because I think knowledge and a mind is so interrelated that it actually helps to flesh out for that person and for their audience. But you're I'd love to talk to you on air as much as, or anytime you want. So you're always welcome back. So thank you very much.
Well, this was great fun. I enjoyed it a lot, and I like talking about interesting topics with interesting people. So
there you go.
I'm happy to do it.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And thank you everybody for listening, and we'll see you next time.